This is the Reason Interview with Nick Gillespie. Thanks for watching or listening. Few figures have had as literally and figuratively an electrifying impact on American culture as Bob Dylan, who released his first album in 1962, won a Nobel Prize for Literature in 2016, and continues to perform about 100 concerts a year at the ripe old age of 83. His life is chronicled in the new movie A Complete Unknown, starring Timothée Chalamet. But what's the meaning or meanings of Bob Dylan, who sang at Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington, became a born-again Christian, and wrote a book called The Philosophy of Modern Song? Today's guest is Jeffrey Green, a political scientist at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of the new book, Bob Dylan, Prophet Without God. Green argues that Dylan's work embodies a uniquely American tension among commitments to individual self-expression, the pursuit of political and social justice, and being right with your version of God. Dylan's willingness to openly struggle with these conflicting demands and his abiding interest in recovering and adapting past musical forms helps to explain why he remains so important to understanding where we've been as a country and where we might be headed, Lincoln County Road or Armageddon. Here is the Reason Interview with Jeffrey Green. Jeffrey Green, author of Bob Dylan, Prophet Without God. Thanks for talking to Reason.
Happy to be here.
So I guess, one of the reasons we're talking with you is because you wrote one of the most interesting and original books of analysis about Bob Dylan's, kind of cultural meaning, certainly that I've read in forever. Another reason is because the book or the movie, A Complete Unknown, is coming out, which is about Bob Dylan kind of going electric. And I don't know for sure because I haven't seen the movie. I've only read about it. Have you seen the movie yet?
Haven't seen the movie, just the trailer.
Okay. So based on the trailer, what do you think about, are you looking forward to the movie? And, why do we keep coming back to this moment where Dylan goes electric?
Well, I'm definitely going to see the movie. As a Dylan guy, I think I have no choice. I'm hopeful that it will be good, but I'll confess some part of me feels like, like the Prophet Muhammad, Bob Dylan should not be depicted. But I think we come back to Dylan in the mid-'60s because he was going through major transformations musically from acoustic to electric, but also politically, going from close affiliation to the civil rights movement and the left to a much more detached, unreliable political standpoint. And the ideas of his music, I think, also shifts and becomes more complicated, more exploratory of consciousness. And as I try to explain in the book, critical of a life of militant, unambiguous leftism, or at least critical of how that life would be for him.
So let's get into the book, Prophet Without God. You say, or in the beginning when you're defining your terms, that Dylan is a prophet of deremption as opposed to salvation. Can you just kind of sketch what those terms mean and why they're so central to things?
Sure. I do take a stand of Dylan being a prophetic figure, and that goes against the grain, I think, of most Dylan analysis. It goes against the grain of what Dylan often, but not always, says about himself, that he is no prophet, etc. But the argument of the book is not only that he is a prophetic figure, and I could explain why I think it's not that controversial to treat him in that form, but that he's a very special kind of prophetic figure. And usually we expect our prophets to have a clear answer for us. And that's, in a nutshell, what a prophet of salvation is. And Dylan doesn't do that. He meanders, he migrates, he evolves. And beyond all that, he does something else that I think is really interesting. He doesn't just not stay put. He suggests that the underlying values that have most informed the prophetic conscience are in conflict with each other, not in harmony. And those values...
What are those values?
I understand three values to have most informed the prophetic conscience. Prophets have tended to speak to adherence to God, social justice, or the call for individual freedom, to be true to yourself and be free. and prophetic figures throughout history have tended to tell us the good news that we get all of those three things together, or they've picked one of those and said to focus on one, even if it means sacrificing the other two. And I think what makes Dylan so interesting is that he not only undisputably speaks about those three values, but he's at his most prophetically distinct and special when he's testifying to the collision between those three values. And my book is organized as three different forays into three different collisions. And so in the 60s, to go back to your first question, I think what's really special about what Dylan is doing from 64 onwards is he's talking about how for him there's a conflict between the call of social justice on the one hand and the call to be a self-reliant, free individual on the other.
And
I'm not
is that if that call or and that collision is kind of intimated earlier when he, as a member of the folk movement or the folk revival in New York, he starts writing his own songs, right? I mean, he very early on begins to separate himself from the collective group that are, kind of guardians of this culture. And he's already kind of intimating that he's going to be a different type of person.
That's true. He, as you say, he was writing his own songs. He had great ambition as an artist from the very beginning. And even though he was closely affiliated with the civil rights movement in the early 60s, attending rallies, including the March on Washington, and singing powerfully against racism, against poverty, against militarism.
War,
And
right?
right, against war, you could perhaps detect, even in that period, some aspect of what was to come. I look at my book at his three songs performed at the March on Washington and suggest from a certain angle they were already reflective of someone not so easily seeing himself and seeing others as just clearly committed to the cause and interested in people who are not fully committed. But yes.
What are those? What were the songs that he performed?
Well, Peter, Paul, and Mary performed "Blowin' in the Wind," a Dylan song, and then he himself performed "When the Ship Comes In," and also "Only a Pawn in Their Game," about a man named Beckwith who had assassinated just 2 months before Medgar Evers in June '63.
And those are I guess talk a little bit about before we get into how Dylan starts shifting out of that and the intimations even in those songs, but the folk revival movement, it seemed to be made up of a couple of different strands that I've always been interested in, and one is that it was this, first off, it was very left wing, right? It was coming out of a Marxist past, or not a Marxist past, excuse me, that's wrong, but a kind of populist, progressive era in the 30s and 40s, and people like Pete Seeger in particular, and Woody Guthrie, really kind of saw themselves as people of the left, and they were helping the little guy. The other thing about it is that it had this sense of authenticity about it, and that it was recovering a past and kind of conserving it. But that isn't quite right, is it? I mean, there was a lot of creation and commercialism that ended up going into the folk revival. And could you talk a little bit about how that plays out when Dylan shows up in New York in the very early '60s?
Right. Dylan is a great inheritor of music. Part of why he's so famous is that, we live in an age of recorded music where his words can be disseminated throughout the world. But Dylan also was one of the first generations to be the recipient of a serious amount of recorded music. And one of the number one things that he received was the prior folk tradition, which I do think, from my understanding, was closely associated with the more radical left. And with a left that was to a meaningful extent persecuted by the McCarthyite scare of the post-war and especially the 50s era. And I think Dylan, even if it was commercial, as you're suggesting, surely rightly so, parts of that movement and parts of that era of folk music, Dylan's era becomes much more commercial. Dylan is not suffering politically from proclaiming his truths. And I think his mindset is not quite the same as the radical left folk artists whom he admired in many respects. I spent some time in the book trying to trace what I call Dylan's bourgeois appropriation of the folk tradition, and there's some subtle changes. I mean, he was clearly inspired by Woody Guthrie, that's well known. But there's a line from his 1962 song to Woody where he says, "The very last thing I'd want to do is to say I've been hitting some hard traveling too." That Dylan knows he hasn't come up through the same struggles as those who had made more sacrifices for challenging the powers that be and who didn't have the same commercial success and monetary success.
In Woody Guthrie's autobiography, which was almost as seminal a text to folk revivalists as the various compilation records that were put out by Alan Lomax or Harry Smith. Woody Guthrie really was a nobody from nowhere who bummed around the country in a way that Dylan is this goes to your point about being bourgeois. I mean, he comes from a solidly middle class family, goes to college, etc. So it's a radically different kind of starting point for Dylan.
And famously tricks people that he had this Guthrie-like past, lying about it, in early interviews. So he put
Sorry.
No, please.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, also before we move into the 60s proper, can we talk a little bit about Pete Seeger? Because Seeger, is really the central figure, the central organizing figure of a kind of folk revival. And he's an interesting character because he, more than almost any other figure in that movement, was blacklisted because he was either a member of the Communist Party or a heavy sympathizer, and he was not able to get on TV, on network TV for decades. I think until the late 60s or early 70s, even he was kind of blacklisted from shows like Hootenanny, which was a network show about kind of the folk music revival that he had really kind of helped create. But he also had a different understanding, that Dylan in some ways is rebelling against, because in the 40s, after the Molotov von Ribbentrop Pact, Seeger, as a member of the Almanac Singers, released an album called Songs for John Doe, which is amazing. It was hard to find for many years. It's available on YouTube and whatnot now, but where it is against the American entry into World War II, because at that point, the Soviets were kind of against that. And there's songs in there attacking Franklin Roosevelt for being a warmonger and he's going to send our boys overseas to die in European wars, etc. And then after Hitler invades the Soviet Union, the Soviet position and the way that communist sympathizers in the U.S. think about things changes. And then Seeger pulls those records and then releases records kind of pushing for the U.S. to join the war effort. And the reason I bring that up is that Seeger was much more of, he was committed to left-wing causes, and he was much more of a communitarian figure, right? Like where he thought the movement was going in a particular direction, and he would subjugate his own beliefs or push his energy in whatever direction the movement was headed.
That's right. And he was much more closely affiliated with radical left politics. He didn't waver, and as I said, suffered for it. And Dylan, was for a while very similarly connected to the same groups, but then withdraws, and I think reflects on a different political standpoint. I think one way to put it is that Dylan is more anti-communist in the early to mid 60s. He's pushing back on McCarthyite hysteria, or the aftermath of McCarthyite hysteria as it lives on in the 60s. And he himself, refused to appear on what would have been his first network television appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show in '63, when his song that he refused to not sing, that they wanted him not to sing, was Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues. So there's a difference between being a communist and being an anti-communist. And I think that there's a connection, but they're still different. And going back to the almanac singers, just thinking about this lineage, because there's a lot of respect and affection between the figures we're talking about here, and yet there's differences. And Dylan's song "Desolation Row" has the line, "Praise be to Nero's Neptune, the Titanic sails at dawn, and everybody shouting, which side are you on?" Well, the Almanac Singers in 1941 had a song, "Which Side Are You On?" which, I'm not 100% sure about it, but it could be seen as a slight pushback against the mentality of people like the Almanac Singers. And the Almanac Singers, where do they get their name? According to Lee Hayes, who was another member of the group, you got to know what the weather's going to be. You need to have your almanac to tell you where you're at. Well, Dylan famously sings, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." So there is this. I think Dylan, and this is part of what makes him so great. He inherits traditions. He responds to those traditions. He alludes to those traditions, and does it, back to your earlier point, often, very often, in his own autonomous voice. And so he's not just repeating what he's gotten from the folk tradition of the 30s and 40s and onwards. He's reconfiguring it, but I don't think it's only artistic originality that's motivating that reconfiguring. I think he's aware of occupying a different socioeconomic position and having a different attitude towards social justice. Not against, but not still the same as these
Right.
folk activists.
And it's amazing. I mean, when you talk about a song like "Only a Pawn in Their Game," and also, he is empathizing with with a white supremacist killer of a civil rights leader. He's demoting him from pure agency to something bigger. And then later, and you talk about this in the book, which is fascinating, when Dylan in the early 60s, I guess in 1963, in December, a month after John F. Kennedy has been assassinated, and he gives a speech where he says that he sees a little of himself in Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, this is different territory, right? It's one thing in the 30s, somebody like Woody Guthrie or Pete Seeger would, they would see themselves in families being dispossessed by bankers, and they might see themselves, somehow having communing with, Pretty Boy Floyd or John Dillinger. But Dylan is kind of putting himself in the shoes of people who are, murderers of the people that the broadly defined left or progressive movement is kind of defending, right? And valorizing.
Absolutely. I think it's an important turning point, that awards dinner in December 1963. That he got the award is itself interesting. 22-year-old kid getting the Tom Paine Award for all of his work devoted to civil liberties, which reminds us that he was meaningfully affiliated with and active within the civil rights movement and was seen as a social justice hero. But at his very award, he possibly was drunk, engages in a rant, mocks the self-satisfaction of the other older, somewhat wealthy, well-off lawyers and civil libertarians in the midst. But most provocatively, yes, says he sees something of himself in Lee Harvey Oswald, who had just the prior month shot Kennedy. And this is a clear moment, maybe the clearest moment of him saying to fellow leftists, "I'm not dependably on your side." It's also in that rant where he says, "I'm getting young. It's taken a long time for me to get young. I'm old. I've been old. You're old. I don't want to be old. I want to get young again." And that becomes the motif of what I think is his most important song of political valedictory, "My Back Pages," which gets released, the next year in '64. So you
And
can
and the refrain of that is, "I was older then, I'm younger than that now."
yes.
Yeah.
And he's saying those basic ideas and words at that rant. So you could almost perhaps hear him, thinking and creating in real time an ideology or claim that becomes definitive of this very unusual perspective. Because that's part of what fascinates me about this, Nick. How many people do you know who are active in a social justice movement then feel it's important for them to publicly explain that they're not going to be as reliably committed to it as you think they are? It's hard to find too many people, I think, who, as a public gesture, do that. Maybe many of us privately live this way. We don't fulfill our moral conscience as much as we would like. But Dylan is not doing only that. He's saying, publicly, singing and statements, I'm not your guy. I'm not going to be a social justice activist, not because I disagree with the movement.
It ain't me, babe, right? I mean,
Exactly.
it's like,
No.
it's funny, one of the things that's great about your book is as you read it, like, I mean, and obviously you're quoting the songs as well, but it's just like a cascade if you know Dylan's lyrics. I mean, it just cascades forward. There's also in that Tom Paine speech, or the Tom Paine Award speech, there's a real generational animus, which is kind of interesting, where he is saying, like, you guys, what, people in the room, you're old. And he's what, I think 22 or 24 at the time or something. Yeah, and it kind of anticipates a later split between in the counterculture, which hasn't really quite formed yet, between the old left and the new left. And obviously Dylan is not part of the new left, even though the Weather Underground takes their name from Subterranean Homesick Blues, a line in that song. But is that, I mean, that's part of, Dylan isn't quite a boomer. He's born in what, 41, I think. So he's a few years before. But there's clearly something about, being born during or just after World War II and growing up in a world of recorded music, of television. And that really, there's a big break in American culture, isn't there? And what is new is quite different.
I mean, Dylan is such a bridge within our culture because he can, I think, credibly be seen as speaking to the commitments of people on numerous sides of cultural divides. And so, who is more iconic about 60s activism and radicalism in a way than Dylan? He's an anthemizer of the movement. And people like Joan Baez think of him as an instrumental leader and wish that he comes back and sings songs, Bobby, won't you listen to your lambs? They're waiting for you. But he also is a figure for getting beyond a leftist standpoint. By the late '60s, he's doing country albums or a country album, and he's not saying for sure whether he's for or against the Vietnam War. And he's moved on, and later in life,
But and he has definitely left behind. You bring this up at multiple points where he's done with what he calls the finger pointing songs, right? Where he's not finger pointing in his music. Although that's not quite true. I want to get to that later because he is. This is the worst kind of cliche, but when people are zigging, he is always zagging. And so we'll get to some more turns of this wheel. But it also seems, what's interesting to me and comes through here is that, I as I was reading your book, I was thinking about him in relation to somebody like Lou Reed, who is both, was a rival of his, but also clearly inspired by him, performs at his 30th anniversary concert and all of that kind of stuff. But Lou Reed just seemed to be a prickly jerk who, like, if you said, Lou, I like this song, he'll be like, fuck you, you don't know anything. And now I'm just going to do the opposite because I want to piss you off. Whereas Dylan, he's the master of the put down song. He's the master of the clean break, and can be quite cruel in his personal life as well as his kind of public commitments. But he doesn't seem to be doing it, as a reaction to you. It's that he has someplace else he wants to go.
Well, he's, I think, as in motion as any popular artist I can imagine and think of, and that differentiates him from most others. There's the degree of his transformations and his longevity on the public stage, and he's also extremely hard to predict, as you're saying, and his relationship to his fans or to critics is one of those things that's very hard to predict. You could go on YouTube and hear him in phone conversations with A.J. Weberman, this crank who wanted him to,
the garbologist, the friend or an acquaintance who ultimately started picking through his garbage to
that's right,
and figure out what Dylan meant.
And Dylan beat him up supposedly for that. But some people would just say, I'm not talking to this guy, but Dylan's on the phone talking to Weberman. You can listen to it on YouTube about whether Dylan sold out and just other political issues. He one of my favorite Dylan stories is he was so upset about a negative review from his gospel shows. When he went gospel, became an evangelical Christian, he tracked down the phone number of this guy, Joel Selvin, and called his house in 1980 trying to get through to him. He was so upset about this review. And so he's someone who seems totally indifferent to what the audience thinks, is not going to usually talk to the audience, and yet nothing is absolute. That's not always going to be the case. He does care to some degree. about what certain people say to him. And to the extent that I've met people who have met him, um, it seems as if he's open to whomever if the time is right. Like he doesn't, he's not going to elevate you or castigate you just based on where you fit in conventional social labels. And I think that openness is part of what makes him such a special person.
You link Dylan's kind of bourgeois individualism, and that it's not meant as a slur, like he's bourgeois, so is less interesting. I mean, it's a descriptive term. I'm not saying it's necessarily uncritical, but you link his kind of rejection of saying, I am going to just be completely committed to the civil rights movement or to social justice. Instead, he, as a deremptive prophet, he's got mixed things that he's pursuing. And you talk about his commitment to individualism and self-expression as being rooted in a tradition that was kind of, or that comes through Emerson and Thoreau. Can you talk a bit about how, what is that strain in Dylan's work, and how does that kind of energize him?
Yeah. Well, I said a moment ago, how many people do you know who publicly say they're not doing all they could or should be doing for a cause they believe in? And the answer to my own question, as far as I know it, is there are only two people. I'm only aware of two others who do something roughly similar, and that would be Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, who were very active in anti-slavery and other social justice causes in their day, but in a way similar to Dylan, acknowledge in their journals or in public statements that they're not going all the way either, because they have this other concern with being self-reliant, free individuals and having the time and space to pursue their other interests as free individuals. And so I put Dylan in conversation with Emerson and Thoreau in the book, both to establish this tradition of realizing there's a potential tension between freedom and justice, but also to show that Dylan, even within this tradition, is distinct, because Dylan does not do what Emerson and Thoreau do about this tension between social justice and individualism. Emerson and Thoreau ultimately take themselves off the hook. They have this view that, oh, there's providence. It's all going to work out anyway, that God will take care of it and justice will prevail. Or they say, I can't really be genuinely effective as a social justice agent if my heart's not fully in it. And so it's not actually going to cost anything if I don't always act and pursue my freedom, because I wouldn't have been effective anyway. Dylan doesn't think like that. And he doesn't say that, well, I'm not complicit if I didn't directly cause the problem. He doesn't make those explicit claims. And so I think Dylan's is a starker account of the tension between freedom and social justice. He's not saying that you shouldn't do social justice. He admires people who are active in it. And in an interview from 1965, when he's already withdrawn, he talks in a Playboy interview about how people are starving and the work needs to be done to alleviate suffering, but he's just not going to do it. And that's, he says it with confidence, but without a sense of being fully morally justified. And that's what I mean by a deremptive prophet, someone who's here to tell you that there's a tension between the values we hold dear. And so I don't think Dylan in this moment's ultimate message is whether to be free or to be serving social justice, but to recognize there's a choice. And at least for people like him, you can't have it all. If you're someone who defines your individuality as fulfilling justice, like maybe Martin Luther King, then you can unify these two values. But if you're someone whose freedom is experienced and pursued away from the constraints of an organized movement, then you're going to be like Dylan and feel that there's this tension, this tragic tension between two worthy goals. And we don't normally expect that type of tragic tension as a communication from prophetic figures. Usually we expect a kind of resolution of the problem, a giving of an answers.
But, and I mean, it's weird because, or it's not weird, but it's like, if you look from a musical perspective, if you look at the people who stayed with folk music as the embodiment or as the soundtrack to social justice, and this is people like Pete Seeger, arguably somebody like Joan Baez as well, that couldn't break with the community expectations, that you play a certain number of songs and then maybe you do a few add-ons, but not really. Those those people become museum pieces, and that tradition, in a strange way, because it doesn't continue to grow, kind of, it becomes something different. It's not. It's a period piece. And Dylan, at least in aesthetic terms, is really, and I think this is common now that he's recognized as the kind of godfather of roots music, of Americana, and not just, folk music, but, blues and hillbilly music and all sorts of things. But is it right to think about it in those terms, or is it also just that, however talented Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and people like that were, they, Dylan is just a once in a, I don't know, like once in a century talent, or he is vast and contains multitudes, in a way that, maybe four or five other figures in American cultural production do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, he is a musician. He is a musical artist, and his transformation that we're talking about in the mid 60s has clear, if not primary, musical meaning, that he's going to perform a different type of music with regard to the sonic sound, with regard to the lyrics and ideas. And so if you see him as pursuing his artistic freedom in withdrawing from the civil rights movement, I would not disagree with that at all. That is clear. But I think sometimes Dylan commentators want to say that's the only way we should see Dylan, as a musician or as a poet, as an artist, and that it's not appropriate to put on these labels like prophet onto him. And I want to push back against that for a variety of reasons. But I also want to admit, I'm not saying Dylan's exactly like, Ezekiel or Amos or some prophet from the Hebrew Bible. And one of the ways that he is different is he is involved in a money-making commercial enterprise. And that means that his prophetic gestures are not only those, that there's often something else happening at the same time. And to a certain extent that weakens the prophetic quality, but I also argue it makes it more digestible, because I think many of us couldn't handle it if we were just getting straight up biblical prophecy. We would turn it off. And so Dylan, I think, allows many more people to tune in to a kind of prophetic message, because that message is encased in some other pursuit, including a musical one or a commercial one. It's interesting, by the way, that the Hebrew prophets were, on some accounts, musical performers, singers. And so for many reasons, we don't want to overstate the difference between prophet and musician, or prophet and poet. And I go into that in the book. But still, yeah, Dylan's a musical artist trying to do new music that the left folk tradition wouldn't have been prepared for and pushed back against him for. And that's a huge part of the story in the mid 60s, at least.
Yeah, well, let's talk at least briefly about the period when he becomes, or seeks seemingly to become, an actual prophet, not of the Old Testament, but of the Book of Revelation, essentially. And this is his Christian period, starting in the late 70s. And for me, I think Slow Train Coming, out of the three gospel records, or evangelical records, is probably the the best accomplishment. But how does this work in your scheme of things? Because here Dylan seemingly, and certainly sonically, commits absolutely to, a oneness, like an identity of belief between his music and what he thinks is the most important thing in the world, which is getting right with Jesus so that you are saved from the lake of fire. I mean, yeah, it's like, how does this work in your scheme?
Well, as you mentioned, it is maybe the time in his life where he most embraces the prophetic label. He makes certain, claims in gospel speeches from the stage. I mean, that's part of what's fascinating about this transformation. It's not just that he puts out these three gospel albums and for a year or two only sings Christian music, but that he's given these fiery sermons from the stage, shocking so many of his listeners. So that's important, that he, anyone who
And
wants to do,
just to
yeah,
dilate on this a bit, he's not saying like, hey, Jesus is a God of love. You should, think about committing your life to him. He is saying, if you don't follow Jesus, if you don't accept Jesus as your personal Lord and Savior, you are going to be condemned to a lake of fire where you will burn for all infinity. I mean, he is way, way out there in a moment when, kind of evangelical Christianity is kind of going mainstream. He is out there as far as anybody.
There is some fire and brimstone in some of those speeches for sure. But I'm always looking for what's prophetically distinct with Dylan. And I think in the 60s, what's distinct is you have a prophetic figure saying, I'm not fully good. That's not what we normally expect. We expect exemplariness. But instead, he's saying, I'm not doing all I could for social justice. And he's doing that prophetically. In the gospel period, I think, of course, from a certain perspective, he's one more Christian, sermonizing about Christianity in a still largely Christian culture. But I think that that interpretation doesn't get at what's so distinct about what's happening at this moment in Dylan's career. And that is, he is so uncannily connecting with a secularist audience. Secularist meaning not just an atheist, but a militant atheist. People who not just are not religious, but think religion is lower than being an atheist. And he, in a variety of ways, this is the theme of the entire part of my second part of my book, is, I argue, disciplining militant atheists to have a little bit more respect for religion by suggesting that they have it in them to be religious too. And part of his ability to do this is structural. He's a rock icon in the late 70s, about to go gospel. Well, your fans are disproportionately secularist by virtue of occupying that position. And people who love Dylan as an icon of self-reliant individuality, challenging all external authority, including organized religion, suddenly had to face the fact that their hero was embracing Jesus and think about it more deeply than if anyone else was embracing Jesus. And by the way, what's fascinating is that Dylan doesn't stay with his gospel period, but it dissipates. His fervor becomes basically erased. And even if he's still a Judeo-Christian to this day, it's no longer central to his music, and he has later statements of doubt. So if you're just taking it all in, Dylan in 79 to 81 was a fervent devotee to Jesus, but that there's a before and then after, that he wasn't always doing this. And so maybe if you're a secularist, you have it in you to have a different mentality towards religion.
Right.
But
Yeah. And by 83, I guess, right, when Infidels comes out, it seems like he might be a born-again Jew, after being a born-again Christian, because, the photography on the album is in Jerusalem, and there's Neighborhood Bully and Joker Man, a couple of songs that seem to be very heavily emphasizing the Jewish experience or the Israelite experience, as opposed to Christian per se.
For sure. And Joker Man is such a beautiful, complicated song. I'm still trying to untangle it, but one, I think, credible interpretation of parts of it is that he seems to be referring to both himself and to a Jesus-like figure as a Joker Man, as someone who's a master of illusion, maybe still having integrity, but also doing things that are false. And so that's part of the post-conversion period he's still in, where I don't think he's no longer, I'm not saying he's no longer deeply religious, but he's not a fervent, gospel sermonizer any longer. But the highlight of my analysis of the gospel period is to look at some of his songs and statements and to suggest in a variety of ways, surprisingly, they do address atheists as atheists. They are perspectives that an atheist ought to be able to recognize. And so it's not just his structure of being a late 70s rock icon, but what he's saying specifically that I think makes him an interesting.
What's a specific example that you can point to?
Well, take the human construction of religion. The idea that human beings make gods, not gods making human beings. That humans make religion, not gods making religion. That idea is typically associated with anti-religious philosophy. One sees it, especially in the Marxist tradition. What's fascinating is how many of Dylan's songs speak words of prayer to concrete humans who have helped elicit and further his conversion. It seems that Dylan, just as a biographical point, was aided along his conversion by the influence of numerous female, often backup singers who testified to him about their faith and that was meaningful. There's stories that Mary Alice Arts, one of his musical collaborators, who was his girlfriend for a time in the late 70s, refused to live with Dylan because she had reconnected with her Christianity, and he was blown away by this. How could anyone care so much about this that they don't want to have a live-in relationship? And she and others testified to him about a life of prayer, about Jesus. And so when he has his conversion, he sings songs like Precious Angel about a concrete human woman, or Covenant Woman about a similar figure. And this is very understandable. Whether you're an atheist or believer, we can perhaps recognize that there are people around us whose influence and presence will either push us to become less or more religious. And so when Dylan is singing to be in the presence of people who will make him more, not less, will strengthen, not enervate his faith, that's very believable. That's just one example. And on this same point of the human construction of religion, he sings a lot of songs that are not about metaphysical questions about God existing or not, but about, hey, you got two types of people, the believers and the non-believers, and these believers are going around disrespecting, the non-believers are going around disrespecting the believers, property of Jesus, watered down love. It's about the political relations between different groups, not about dogmatic assertions about heaven or hell or whether God exists. In fact, I try to go through all the songs from the gospel period on the albums, at least, and I suggest that a majority of them don't presuppose the existence of God, even, which is not to say that Dylan is against the existence of God, but that so much of what he's singing about doesn't operate there.
I'll say Precious Angel, which I think is one of his greatest songs and performances, recorded performances, is on a certain level is also a fantastic diss track, though, at the same point, right? Because he both is talking about the woman who brings him to Jesus, but then also the woman at the well who complains about her husband, but she can't mention Jesus Christ, like she mentions Buddha and Muhammad, etc. It's a remarkably layered period that was, at least Slow Train Coming, was commercially successful and critically successful in a way that the other two albums were not quite as much. But that's also kind of interesting that he was able to do pretty well, at least with one of those records.
Yeah, I think he won a Grammy for "Gotta Serve Somebody."
Yeah.
And look, I mean, musically, it's fantastic. I agree with your account of Soul Train Coming. I love that album. You have Jerry Wexler producing it. Yeah. You have Mark Knopfler playing guitar.
Yeah. And the production is so clean, like in a way that a lot of '80s albums, just for other reasons, not just limited to Dylan, just get real muddy sounding and whatnot.
He went down to Muscle Shoals for that and recorded it in that studio. And, the backup singers are fantastic. So I agree. Yeah.
How let me ask you, how did you get into Dylan? Because, one of the things, Dylanology, and, I think A.J. Weberman, who is a nut, right, is a crazy person, was kind of considered the first Dylanologist, but like Dylanology is a fraught enterprise, and it almost always tells you more about the Dylanologist than Dylan. But with that as an intro, how did you get into Dylan, and how did you encounter him, and what does he mean to you beyond? Well, I mean, I think I know what he means to you through the book, but how did you become taken with his work?
I can remember really listening to him for the first time in a sustained way, being 16 years old, 1990. I had bought the Biograph box set and started listening to those songs, and some of them, many of them, just were way beyond me, but a few of them, connected with, and I guess the last 3+ decades, just continuing to make sense of them more, but just struck me as very powerful, authentic, sincere music, and then just the things I learned after then continued to amaze me. Very early, I was just surprised and fascinated by his relationship to the civil rights movement. I just didn't make sense to me, or I just felt so unusual. What we talked about a moment ago, how someone could withdraw from it, not because they're against it, and have the movement be a problem. So that just, philosophically at an early age, stuck with me. And then, when I found out about his evangelical period, that was just surprising. But I think at the psychological level, I'm realizing as I get older that the music just animates me. Like when I listen to Dylan, it just gives me energy, and um, uh, like few other things do. And of course, I focus mostly on the ideas, the lyrics, the statements. That's where my book operates. But it's just amazing also on the pure sonic level, in my opinion, and the diversity of sounds and styles is so impressive artistically. And then if you become a Dylanologist, which I guess I've become, it's like an education because the man has so many influences. He's influenced so many, but he's been inspired by so many sources of music, by so many literary ideas, philosophical ideas, that just tracing his influences becomes a kind of source of development and education. I've had my ups and downs over the years. I mean, ebbs and flows rather, with my Dylan obsession, but I've been a pretty big Dylan guy since I was 16.
Do you, one of the things, and I guess his last, original album, which came out a few years ago, Rough and Rowdy Ways, and contains tracks that, were recorded sometime over the previous decade or so. It's fascinating because, like, even in some of the songs, he is, kind of listing different people throughout American history and connecting them. And there's a terrible version of this in something like Billy Joel's "We Didn't Start the Fire," where it's just the worst kind of mishmash of just stringing together names that rhyme. But Dylan seems to be drawing connections in a world where we are less tradition bound than ever. We are arguably, because of the internet, we have all of all of history, all recorded and pre-recorded history is at our fingertips, but we're more presentist than ever. And he seems to be sketching these points of like, okay, well, this connects to this and this and this, and he's giving us the opportunity to kind of create. I mean, the way I read it, he seems to be telling us, you need to create your own tradition. So he does this in the book from a couple of years ago, The Philosophy of Modern Song, as well. Where other than just chalking it up to individual genius, which is unsatisfying, from a materialist perspective, but also an intellectual one, how where does that come from in his life? How do we make sense of him always being interested, in "It's All Right, Ma," the song, he talks about he not busy being born is busy dying. But then in every stage of his life, he is constantly elaborating connections between the past and the present and the future, going
Yeah,
sideways, etc. How do we make sense of that?
that's really well said. I like what you're saying about Dylan encouraging people to make their own traditions, which doesn't mean just invent everything from scratch, but being open to elements of the past and finding those elements that should be put together for you. So it's a mixture of autonomy and deference. Um, as some others have said, I think Dylan potentially seeks revitalization by going back, bringing it all back home. One of his key albums of Going Electric and giving us this new amazing rock music is, as its very title suggests, a return, and it is a return in some ways to rhythm and blues and to non-folk idiom that was already there. Um, and certainly, there's nothing more traditional than Jesus, and so there's a going back, even as he was doing something that seemed provocative and new as a pop artist, and in his later years, I think he's mined the blues tradition and gone back towards being even more rootsy. He was in a kind of professional, perhaps spiritual crisis in the late '80s, and how he seems to have gotten out of it was to get rid of the sort of '80s style music, get rid of the backup singers, not that they were bad, and to become more of a conventional blues man, if you wanted to simplify him, over the last few decades. And so it's not only, just to build on what you said, it's not only finding your own tradition, but believing that it's there's something sustaining about it or regenerating about it, healthy about it, and the exact mechanics of that I'm not as clear about as I should be, but I feel as if there's a way in which he finds vocational purpose as an individual by reconnecting with a prior tradition, and maybe as you're also saying in this recent album, in that song "Murder Most Foul" in particular, about the Kennedy assassination, but also about this collage of American references. He's setting a scene or generating a broader tradition of 20th century American life that hopefully would be sustaining and not just nostalgic, but to fit with the point.
I guess I've got a couple more questions for you. One is, does Dylan? We know that he was committed to the civil rights movement, and then at various stages, the one thing about Dylan is that going down to his very name and where the name came from, his pseudonym. You can never really believe. I mean, you believe him when he's saying it, but you know that it's made up, right? Or it's going to shift and things like that. But and Dylan was committed to the civil rights movement, and wrote some of the songs that really galvanized that movement as well as the country. And then at other points he said, I was just doing that to, because my girlfriend was into it, or, he would minimize various things. But can we say he has a politics, or is there a politics, Bob Dylan? And, you mentioned the John Birch blues song, which has a line, kind of mocking Barry Goldwater. And then in his memoir, which I guess is from the early 2000s or mid 2000s, he recounts a story where he's talking to Dave Van Ronk, who is the mayor of McDougal Street, a big figure in the Greenwich Village folk scene, and he is a conventional kind of lefty of the moment. And Dylan says, I didn't have the heart to tell Dave Van Ronk that I kind of liked Barry Goldwater. He reminded me of Tom Mix, the cowboy star, and I liked his county fair politics. Like, at various points, there was a Rolling Stone article when Obama was running for re-election where the interviewer was trying to get him to say, "What, you're going to vote for Barack Obama, aren't you?" And he's like, "No, man. What do you want me to say? Like, I'll say it, but I'm not necessarily going to believe it." Like, is there a politics to Dylan, or does it matter?
Well, this is the final third of my book. One part being the '60s and the tension between freedom and justice. The second part being the gospel period. But the third part is about this question you're asking: what is his politics? Is there anything distinct about it? And I think that quite consistently over his 60 plus years on the public stage, you see from Dylan a pessimism about conventional politics, a pessimism about politicians. It's very hard to find a positive word about a politician in Dylan's lyrics or statements. I'm not sure I'm aware of any. And a pessimism about
He has more good things to say about Joey Gallo that he does
yeah,
about politicians, right?
yeah. And might see conventional politicians as having, a plutocratic for sure, but potentially also criminal element themselves. So it's very critical of our conventional electoral-based politics, assuming there's always going to be plutocracy to some meaningful degree, always going to be violence and war. I don't take him to say that we can't make local improvements in certain specific places. I think the civil rights movement was an effort at a genuine improvement in a specific country. But he philosophizes about the world. That's part of what makes him prophetic. He talks about what the world as such is like. And the world as such, as I read him, is fallen. It's going to be mired forever in injustice, in violence, in war, and plutocracy. And he doesn't see our typical electoral choices as being always, and perhaps not mostly, that helpful to get out of that predicament. And so what comes out of that pessimism is not just throwing up your hands. I try to show in the final part of my book how there's an edge to it, that his pessimism contains a redirection of ethical energy, not just a forgoing of ethical energy. And one aspect of that redirection is to focus more on humanitarian assistance. And you see that in his personal political decisions, because once he's no longer involved in 60s activism, he does sporadically get re-involved. He concerns himself with the plight of the Bangladeshis in the early 70s, Farm Aid in the 80s, his Christmas in the Heart 2009 album. The proceeds go to hunger and homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that...
and it was We Are the World, famously.
We Are the World would be, of course, an act of humanitarian assistance. And so I think that I wouldn't want to attribute to him something too absolute, that elections don't matter, that democracy is no different from non-democracy. But I think he provocatively challenges us to ask ourselves, to what degree does our fascination with the horse race of elections sometimes blind us to other ways of getting involved that might be more directly beneficial to people in dire need? And I think in a country like the US, where our election season is so long and so expensive and so entertaining, one can really listen to that challenge.
Yeah. A final question for you, or area to kind of think about. So we've been talking about Dylan, and we obviously, for our own individual reasons, take Dylan's kind of greatness or stature or influence, I guess, and presence for granted. I was born in '63, so I'm a late boomer, and I resisted Dylan for a long time because all of the people who were 10 years older than me wouldn't shut the fuck up about him. And it's, you don't, I didn't want to hear it for a long time. I take it from your Gen X.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, we're talking, this should be released the day that the movie A Complete Unknown comes out, where Timothée Chalamet, who is like the it guy of, I guess, millennials, or maybe the older edge of Gen Z, or is coming out. Like, how does Dylan matter, or how might he matter to millennials and Gen Z in a way where he does not become kind of the Pete Seeger to them, of somebody who's important, and you can pay, you pay your respects, but it's like, oh, this is like an old guy who's picking a banjo or talking about the Spanish Civil War, and we're talking about Vietnam. How does Dylan how might Dylan matter to younger people, do you think?
Well, the future remains to be seen. And if anyone wouldn't be surprised that Dylan would be forgotten, it would be Dylan himself, who's often said as much, that, people are not going to remember me or anyone else. And we all take ourselves too seriously. And that's part of his strength, is that he somehow is aware of that. But I would be on the side of thinking that Dylan will continue to matter a lot in our culture, and in the millennial culture, and the even younger culture, that he's done too much for too long to be denied, and that there's really very few figures who combine such popular appeal. He's a pop cultural artist with such literary heft. And we certainly have lots of people who have sold more albums than Dylan has. There's a few dozen who have. And there's certain, modernist poets and others, we might say, are no less deep and critically acclaimed. But how many people bring those two dimensions into connection? Someone who's, has a mass audience, and who is so um, intellectually sophisticated, and who has fortunately been around for so long that he can use his mind and his gifts in such different ways. And so, I would be among those comparing him to the greats that have stood the test of time, like a Shakespeare. And I think my prediction will be that he will connect to future generations for the reasons that I've said. Um, but um, but there will also, of course, be people who don't know who he is, and don't care, and that's
Does
part of
he
it too.
does he
Yeah.
hold as much, what is his appeal, maybe, to, let's say, women, and to blacks and Latinos? Because on a certain level, and this, I'm being, kind of provocative here, of saying, like, Dylan on a certain level, and I was thinking this when Martin Scorsese's No Direction Home documentary came out, and there were interviews where that had actually been recorded by Dylan and his manager, where he's very much of a beatnik. I mean, the cadence of his talk, and Chronicles is like that. It's really a sustained work of beat writing, of kind of Jack Kerouac, who shows up in a lot, in various ways in his work, explicitly and implicitly. And that makes sense to me, but I'm also like a mid-century, middle class guy, white guy, right? Does Dylan, how does he speak to in America that is, less male dominated?
Well, he is a male, of course, and he's singing in a fairly self-consciously male way, often heterosexual male, and so those identities are going to perhaps color the way he's experienced and maybe favor who likes him the most. But my guess is that you're right, that there is this demographic difference among Dylan fans, but the Dylan phenomenon is still so large and so vast, and that he's connected with people from all backgrounds of all types. And I think that if there was a way in to him from a perspective that felt very distinct from his identity, it would be the attraction of what a super free mind sounds like, and what it does to you, and how it inspires you and makes you want to listen. And I think it's that charisma, that artistic integrity, that I think has a lot of force and has inspired people from all backgrounds to listen to him and to contribute to the tradition that he started by making albums about him from their own perspective. So that would be my sense of it.
Yeah, he and on Rough and Rowdy Ways, one of the songs is "I Contain Multitudes," and he certainly does and reflects it back out. I guess as a final question, do you have a favorite Dylan song or Dylan album?
I'll just say that right now, fall 2024, I've been glued to "Springtime in New York," which is one of these bootleg albums from the early 80s, around the time of Infidels, right after the gospel period. And I'm really discovering that and appreciating it. So
that has Blind Willie McTell on it, right?
Has a version of that on it. That's exactly right.
One of the things that is kind of very impressive about Dylan is like his bootleg or the outtakes he leaves on records are like that would be most other performers' greatest hits, right?
It's absolutely shocking, the quality.
What do you like about "Springtime in New York"?
Well, you see him. It's funny. There's a song that also wasn't released, "Foot of Pride," that's on a different bootleg album. And then on "Springtime in New York," you have a beautiful song that became "Foot of Pride" called "Too Late." And then another version of "Foot of Pride." And they're all different. The lyrics, there's some similarity, but there's some difference. And so it's not the only thing I like about the album, but you can really see him developing and rewriting, and how every time he sings something, it's going to be a little bit different on purpose. But I think that I've come to feel that Dylan, and I've heard this from others, writes his songs from the ground up. Like he writes lyrics like on the single line level that he likes, and then he puts them together in a broader song. And so what that means sometimes is that Dylan is going to, have a verse that really works, but maybe the rest of the song less so, or have a line that really works, but the rest of the verse less so. And so part of loving some of these songs is not just the way they sound and the way they make you feel, but there's certain just aphoristic nuggets in some of these songs that make you think. And I'm a political theorist by trade, and things that get the mind working and the food for thought are very special. And I think that's, I guess I've been alluding to it all along, but that's part of what Dylan does is just energize the mind. And I'm finding, as much as many other albums, I suppose, but right now that album is having some new discoveries. I love that song, "Too Late."
Yeah. That's great to hear. Thank you very much, Jeff Green. The book is Bob Dylan, Prophet Without God. Thanks for talking to Reason.
Thanks for having me.